For generations, fishermen whispered of a curse lingering beneath Blackwater Cove's tides. The village sat on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods and a grey, restless sea. People talked about strange things that happened there, boats that vanished in the fog, whole families gone without a trace, and the way the place always seemed a little colder than it should. When Detective Robert Borne arrived, he anticipated secrets, but something far worse lurked beneath the tide. He thought he'd seen everything New York had to offer, but nothing prepared him for what waited in Blackwater Cove. Robert Borne didn't belong in a place like Blackwater Cove. He realized it the second he drove past the sagging welcome sign near the village limits. The paint faded by too many harsh winters. A burned-out NYPD detective chasing patterns had followed an unsolved string of coastal disappearances to this cove. And now he was hundreds of miles from the city, wondering if he had made a mistake. New York had drained him. Too many years spent squinting at evidence photos, too many cases that ended with more questions than answers. He'd built a reputation for stripping away the noise and finding the truth. But lately, even the truth felt thin. Each case bled into the next. Another missing kid, another family shattered, another night spent staring at files long after everyone else had gone home. He'd spent most of his career in a city that never stopped moving. The city's rhythm, sirens, shouting, the hum of traffic had become background noise, something he barely noticed until it was gone. In Maine, the silence pressed in from all sides. The drive north had been long and uneventful, the landscape shifting from city grime to endless forests and rocky coastline. Maine's villages clung to the edge of land and sea, battered by storms and shaped by tradition. People here didn't talk much, especially to outsiders. And Borne knew from the case file that secrecy was part of the problem. The file that brought him here was thin. A fisherman lost on a routine haul. A couple vanished during a late-night walk. A family disappeared from their home with dinner still on the table. Official reports offered little. The interviews were all the same. Locals shrugging, avoiding details. Reporters filling in the gaps with talk of bad weather or tragic accidents. But there was something else. Something that didn't fit. Each missing person lived near Blackwater Cove. The gaps in their stories were too similar, as if everyone in town was reading from the same script. In his years with the NYPD, Borne had learned to spot patterns, and this one felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the missing people. In many New England fishing villages, sudden disappearances at sea had always fueled talk of curses. Stories about angry spirits, ancient shipwrecks, and the sea demanding payment for old sins. These tales lingered in places like Blackwater Cove, where families traced their roots back generations, and superstition was part of daily life. Borne didn't put stock in folklore, but the way it crept into every interview and every rumor made him uneasy. Phrases like the curse of the sea and sins the water never forgave kept popping up, not just as throwaway lines, but as warnings. He'd tried to dismiss it, telling himself that maritime disappearances were just part of life on the coast. People underestimated the ocean. Boats went missing, storms rolled in without warning, and sometimes the sea didn't give back what it took. But the more he read, the more he felt pulled in. The Fitch family, Henry, Laura, and their daughter Madeline, had vanished from their house in the middle of a storm. The neighbors said the place was silent that night, an odd detail that stuck with him. Silence wasn't normal in a storm, not in a tightly packed village like this. It was as if the house had been cut out of the world for a few hours, and no one wanted to talk about it. His decision to come to Blackwater Cove wasn't logical. He told himself it was about the facts, about following the evidence, but deep down he knew it was instinct. Years ago, his old partner had told him to trust his gut. "Instinct saves your ass," he used to say, tapping Borne's desk with a yellowed finger. Maybe that was why, on a grey September morning, Borne found himself driving north, the bends humming beneath him, the roads getting narrower and the woods pressing closer with every mile. The approach to Blackwater Cove was almost theatrical in its bleakness. The highway wound between dense stands of pine, the sky growing heavier with clouds the closer he got. The air changed too, picking up a briny tang that clung to everything. By the time the village appeared through the fog, Borne felt the weight of the place settle on his shoulders. The buildings looked tired, clapboard houses with peeling paint, a general store with a sign that barely hung on, fishing boats bobbing in the harbour like ghosts. There was movement, but it was subdued. People kept their heads down, eyes flicking past him as if he might disappear if they didn't look too hard. He parked near the store and sat for a moment, watching the scene. A woman on the bait shop steps glanced up, then away. A fisherman dragged a net across the dock, never breaking stride. There was no welcome, no curiosity, just a kind of wary indifference. Borne had seen small towns before, but this felt different. The silence wasn't just about not talking, it was about not wanting to be seen. He got out and reached for his leather satchel, the familiar weight grounding him. As he stepped onto the uneven cobblestones, the quiet pressed in tighter. He tried to remind himself that wariness was normal in places like this, especially toward outsiders, but there was something else here, something colder. He caught bits of conversation as he passed, a muttered word, a warning cut short. People avoided his gaze, shifting away as he approached, their faces closed and unreadable. He noticed small things too, the way some villagers' skin looked oddly pale, the way their eyes seemed too large in the fading light. He told himself it was just the weather, just genetics, but the unease wouldn't leave him. Borne's reputation for cynicism had always served him well. He didn't believe in curses or haunted seas, but as he made his way deeper into the village, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The stories, the silence, the way everyone seemed to know more than they would say, it all added up to a puzzle he couldn't solve from the outside. What did the locals know but refuse to say? Robert tugged the satchel strap across his shoulder and stepped onto the cobblestone street. The moment his boots hit the uneven ground, he felt the village close in around him. The salt-stained buildings leaned into the fog, wood creaking softly, and a wind swept cold mist down the narrow lanes. People moved with a kind of practiced caution, heads tipped low, shoulders tight, as if guarding something. It wasn't the busy kind of quiet he'd known in the city. This was thick, heavy silence, the sort that pressed in from all sides and made every footstep sound too loud. The general store was just ahead, its windows clouded with grime. A young boy crashed on the curb out front, dragging a stick through a puddle. His jacket hung off one shoulder, soaked, but he didn't seem to care. When he saw Robert, he froze, then turned and slipped quickly inside. Robert watched him go, then caught sight of an older man unloading crates from a rusted pickup nearby. The man never looked up, his hands working steadily at the frayed rope, back hunched under a thick flannel. There was something off about him, ears that looked a little too pointed, skin weathered but almost grey, and eyes that were wide and unblinking, the whites oddly large around pale irises. When the man finally glanced Robert's way, it was only for a second before he slammed the last crate down and turned away. Inside, the general store was even quieter. The air was thick with brine and something metallic. Shelves were half-stocked, flour, crackers, a few cans stacked in neat rows. An older woman stood behind the counter, her frame lost in a heavy sweater. She didn't look up, her hands folded on the counter, knuckles prominent and pale. Robert stepped forward and tried to sound casual. "Hi," he started. "We're closed." Her voice was flat, hoarse, and final. She didn't raise her head. He glanced at the clock on the wall, barely past midday. "Didn't know stores out here closed this early. I just wanted to ask—" "You shouldn't stay." Her words were clipped, the kind of warning that didn't invite questions. She bent her head again, and Robert stood there, not sure what to do next. The only other sound was the faint hum of a bulb overhead. Back on the street, Robert leaned against a post and pulled out his notepad. He scribbled the name of the store, but his pencil hovered. Every interaction felt like a door slamming quietly in his face. The villagers' silence wasn't just about not talking, it was in their movements, their faces, the way they kept their distance. Sunken cheeks, waxy skin, and eyes that looked too large, too watery, like they were always watching from somewhere underwater. It was subtle, but once he started noticing, he couldn't stop. He watched a man walk by, hands tucked into the pockets of a slicker. As he passed, Robert caught a glimpse of something odd, webbing between the man's fingers, thin and damp-looking, flashing for just a second before the man disappeared down the street. It wasn't dramatic, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but Robert saw it. He tried to reason it away. Coastal towns could be insular. Genetics played tricks. Old bloodlines sometimes showed up in strange ways. But it stuck with him. He headed down toward the docks, the boards groaning under his feet. The harbor was lined with boats, most of them small and battered, nets piled high, the smell of fish thick in the air. Fish heads stared up blankly from the wet planks, and the sea slapped quietly against the pilings. Here, finally, someone spoke. A wiry man in his 60s was cleaning fish near the edge, hands moving with practiced speed. His eyes darted constantly, never settling. "Robert Borne," he said, keeping his voice even. "Detective from New York. I'm here about the missing family, the Fitches. Know anything?" The man's knife kept moving, slicing through scales and flesh. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, without looking up, he said, "You should leave." Robert tried to keep his tone light. "I've heard that a lot today. Is that just friendly advice or something else?" The man's hands stilled. The knife hovered over the fish's spine. "It's not a joke," he said, voice low and rough. "The sea don't forgive what this village has done. You're no better off here than the Fitches were." Robert frowned. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, shoes slapping on the damp wood. The fisherman wiped his hands on his apron, shook his head, and turned toward the water. "Ask them yourself," he muttered, assuming they're not already beneath it. Robert watched him for a while, but the man didn't say anything else. There was no sense pushing. The fear here was too deep, too settled. It reminded him of stories he'd read about cursed villages, places where tragedy lingered like a fog, where people believed in things they couldn't explain. He thought about the way the villagers moved, the strange look in their eyes, the hints of something not quite human in their faces and hands. It was like the whole village was shaped by whatever haunted it, inside and out. He wandered back through the center of town as the sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows over the crooked houses. The sense of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it felt stronger the longer he stayed. He noticed marks carved into the wood of some doorways, shapes he didn't recognize, symbols that looked old and worn smooth by weather and time. He saw them again on the hulls of fishing boats, scratched into the paint, half hidden by nets. The air was turning colder, and the fog was creeping in from the water, swallowing the edges of the village. Robert paused outside one of the empty houses, eyes lingering on the cracked windows and the way the door hung slightly open. He knew he wasn't going to get answers from the villagers. Not directly. Whatever secrets Blackwater Cove kept, they were buried deep, guarded by fear and something older than superstition. He slipped his notepad back into his pocket and looked up at the darkening sky. The silence of the village pressed in again, thicker than before. It was something here that didn't fit any pattern he'd seen before. The clues were scattered and strange. Silent warnings, odd glances, marks that meant nothing to him but seemed to mean everything to the people here. He felt the old instinct kicking in, the one that told him to keep looking even when it didn't make sense. The answers weren't going to come easy. He'd have to find them himself, in the places the villagers didn't want him to go. He took a slow breath, watching the fog swallow the last of the daylight. The village was settling in for the night, doors closing, lights flickering out one by one. Robert knew he'd have to move quietly, follow the threads no one else would talk about. He turned away from the main street, his steps echoing on the empty stones, and set his sights on the abandoned house at the end of the lane. The Fitch house felt different from the rest of the village. The rot here wasn't just in the wood or the air. It pressed in from all sides, as if the place itself remembered what happened. Robert stepped through the front door, the hinges groaning and the smell of salt water and mildew hit him right away. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The living room was a mess, furniture overturned, suitcases half-packed and spilling onto the floor. There were signs of panic everywhere. A child's toy left behind, a photo album with pages sticking together from damp, dishes stacked awkwardly on the counter, like someone meant to leave in a hurry but never got the chance. He moved carefully, not wanting to disturb anything more than he had to. The details here didn't feel random. The suitcases, the scattered belongings, the glass cracked on the floor, they all pointed to a family trying to get away fast. He'd seen scenes like this before, but usually there was a reason that could be explained. A break-in, a fight, a threat you could see. Here, it felt like the threat was everywhere and nowhere at once. Upstairs, the floorboards sagged under his weight. He went past the child's room, the walls a faded yellow, and saw a coloring book warped by water, pages curling in on themselves. He didn't linger. It was the master bedroom that pulled him in. The air was thicker here, the humidity sharper, and on a warped desk by the window he spotted a leather-bound journal. It looked battered, the cover flaking, but the pages inside were crowded with frantic handwriting. He opened it and started reading. The entries weren't just rambling, they circled around one idea, an ancient sea presence demanding penance. The author kept repeating how they're watching and how the tide never lets you go. Certain words, demand, penance, sacrifice, stood out, scratched darker and more desperate every time. There were drawings too. One showed waves reaching up, shapes in the water that looked almost like faces or hands. Underneath, in big, uneven letters, was written, "The Watchers never forget." He kept flipping through, the sense of dread growing with every page. The writing got more frantic, sentences breaking up, thoughts unfinished. It sounded like someone who knew they were running out of time. He found a page near the end where the handwriting calmed for a moment. It read, "The tide is coming. We can't escape." That line stuck with him, echoing what he'd heard whispered around the village and what the fishermen had said about the sea not forgiving. Beneath the journal, under a pile of papers ruined by water, He found another book, smaller, brown and warped almost beyond recognition. He opened it and the smell of mildew and salt was even stronger. The pages were filled with strange symbols, none of which looked like any language he knew. They were made up of wave-like shapes, hooks and fins, all twisted together. He realized he'd seen these same marks before, carved into the wood of boats down at the docks, scratched into door frames and hulls around the village. He thought about how isolated communities sometimes had their own explanations for things. Old bloodlines, closed-off families, stories that got passed down and twisted over time. But this was different. The symbols weren't just decoration. They matched the ones in the journal, and they were everywhere in Blackwater Cove. It felt like the whole village was marked, like the symbols were a warning or maybe a promise. He tried to reason it away, telling himself that people in places like this sometimes used rituals to make sense of things they couldn't control. But that line of thought didn't help. The more he saw, the more it felt like these weren't just stories. There was a pattern to it all. The disappearances, the carvings, the way the villagers kept their distance and looked at him with those wide, unblinking eyes. He kept going back to the journal, searching for anything that might explain what was really happening. The entries talked about the Watchers and the tide, but there were hints of something even older. Rituals, sacrifices, a promise the village had made long ago. The words ancient debt and sea's demand came up more than once. It sounded like the villagers believed they owed something to whatever lived in the water, and that if they didn't pay, it would come for them. The last entry in the journal was the most chilling. It was written in a steadier hand, almost like the writer had accepted what was going to happen.
The tide is coming. We can't escape. It was the same feeling Robert had gotten from the fishermen at the docks, and from the way the villagers watched him without saying anything. It wasn't just fear, it was resignation. He put the books back where he found them, his hands shaking a little. The house was even quieter now, the only sound the faint creak of wood shifting in the wind. He looked around one last time, taking in the unfinished suitcases, the open colouring book, the symbols scratched into the window frame. It all added up to something he couldn't explain, something that didn't fit any pattern he'd seen before. As he stepped outside, the sky had darkened, and the fog was rolling in thicker than before. He felt exposed, like whatever watched the Fitch family was now watching him. The village was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that made you feel safe. It was the kind that made you want to move quickly and not look back. He knew he couldn't ignore what he'd found. The clues weren't just pieces of a puzzle, they were warnings. The villagers' silence, the symbols, the frantic notes in the journal, all pointed to something that went beyond simple superstition. There was a ritual here, something old and terrible, and it was still happening. He could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken as night approached, in the way the houses closed up tight, and in the way the sea never stopped moving, always just out of sight, but never gone. Robert started back toward the village centre, his mind racing. He needed to see for himself what the villagers did when the sun went down. There were answers out there, but they wouldn't come from questions asked in daylight. The moon hung low and clear over the rocky shoreline, throwing silver shadows across the black water and slick stones. I crouched behind a jagged boulder, knees aching, but I barely noticed the discomfort. My eyes stayed fixed on the group of villagers gathering below, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved with a sense of direction I hadn't seen during the day. No more shuffling or avoiding my stare. Now, each step was sure, each movement rehearsed. The full moon's light caught the edges of their cloaks, making them look almost spectral as they formed a loose ring at the water's edge. They knelt, chanting in an alien tongue, and cast braid, bones, and strange bundles into the surf. The sounds they made didn't belong to any language I knew. The syllables crashed and rolled, guttural and sharp, sometimes rising in a low drone, sometimes breaking into short, clipped bursts. It wasn't just noise, it was ritual. The rhythm of their voices made the hair on my arms stand up. The offerings hit the water and disappeared instantly, swallowed up by the waves as if the sea itself was waiting for them. I tried to pick out faces as they moved. The woman who'd thrown the braid stood with her hands clasped tight, staring out at the horizon. The man with the battered wooden box pried it open, shaking out its contents, metal glints, maybe coins or jewelry, and something that looked like a small animal skull. Another figure, hands trembling, tossed a bundle wrapped in stained linen so carefully that it didn't even splash when it hit. The group never broke their rhythm. Each offering was followed by the same chant, the same slow bow of their heads, the same moment of silence before the next person stepped forward. The water crept higher, soaking their boots, but they didn't flinch. Instead, the chanting grew sharper, almost frantic, and the villagers stepped deeper into the surf. The moonlight shimmered on the water, turning the whole scene pale and unreal. I pressed myself further into the rock, barely daring to breathe. That's when the changes started. It happened fast, like the ritual had flipped a switch. Limbs stretched, skin turned slick with scales, gills flared, and eyes ballooned into inhuman proportions. One man's arms lengthened so suddenly he stumbled, hands twisting until his fingers fused into webbed paddles. The woman's neck bulged, skin spitting to reveal dark slits that pulsed with every breath. Faces warped, mouths widening, jaws unhinging, teeth sharpening into rows that didn't fit inside a human skull. Their eyes, already too large, grew even bigger, reflecting the moonlight in wide, glassy orbs. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The villagers' bodies blurred the line between human and something else entirely. Their movements slowed, becoming almost graceful, like they belonged in the water now. The chanting faded, replaced by a wet, rasping breath that sounded wrong in the open air. The surf crashed around them, but they didn't seem to notice. They just kept moving forward, deeper into the tide, until the water reached their chests, then their shoulders. One by one, they slipped beneath the surface. I saw flashes of limbs twisting, saw gills open and close along their necks, saw the last glimmer of a wide, unblinking eye before it vanished below the waves. The shoreline was empty except for the moonlight and the scattered remnants of the ritual. The wind picked up, carrying the last echoes of that alien chant out to sea. I stayed hidden, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. My mind scrambled for explanations, but nothing fit. It wasn't mass hysteria, it wasn't a trick of the light. I'd seen the villagers change. I'd seen them become something else, something the sea had claimed. The symbols, the warnings, the journal entries about ancient debts and watchers, it all pointed to this moment. The moon kept shining cold and bright, as if it was the only witness left. I finally let out a shaky breath and pushed myself back from the boulder, legs stiff. I glanced once more at the water.
half expecting to see faces staring back at me from beneath the surface. There was nothing. Just the restless tide and a stretch of wet sand. I whispered, "What have they become?" With that question stuck in my mind, I made my way up the path toward the village, the ritual's images flickering behind my eyes. I needed answers, real ones. The symbols in the waterlogged book, the carvings on boats and doorways, the frantic warnings in the journal, all hinted at something older and more powerful than I'd imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the villagers had turned into, it was only part of the story. Back in my motel room, I sat at the desk, the battered book open in front of me. The bulb overhead flickered, casting shaky light across the pages. I traced the strange symbols with my finger, trying to make sense of them. There had to be a reason for what I'd seen, some explanation buried in these pages or in the carvings I'd found around Blackwater Cove. I stared at the words, the shapes, the warnings, searching for a pattern. Something out there connected the villagers, the rituals, and the sea. I was sure of it. And now, with the memory of the transformation fresh in my mind, I knew I had to find out what monstrous entity waited beneath the waves.
Spent the rest of the night hunched over the motel desk, the battered book open in front of me and the lamp humming overhead. The symbols on those pages weren't just random marks or someone's fever dream. The more I looked, the more I saw the same shapes, repeating spirals, hooks, and lines that seemed to mimic the pull of the tide or the sweep of a net. It hit me all at once. The patterns weren't random. They mapped sacrificial rites, binding the town to anarchy beneath the waves. Every offering, every ritual, every mark scratched into the wood back in the village fit into this system. The rules were simple and cruel. Give to the sea, or the sea takes what it wants. The journal helped fill in the gaps. The Fitchers wrote about a presence beneath the water, something that watched and waited. It feeds on what we give it, one line said, and another, if we fail, it comes for us. The handwriting got worse as the entries went on, words slanting, letters running together as if the writer was trying to get everything down before it was too late. The fear on those pages wasn't just about the villagers or the rituals. It was about what waited below, something hungry and old. I got up, grabbed my coat, and pocketed the book. The air outside was cold and wet. I didn't want to go back to the docks, not after what I'd seen there. So I walked along the edge of town until the road turned to gravel and the houses faded away. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged and dark against the sky. I followed the shoreline, boots sinking into the damp sand, until I found a break in the rock. It was wide enough to walk through, but there was nothing inviting about it. The opening looked more like a wound than a cave. Inside it was even colder. My flashlight beam bounced off the walls, catching on bits of broken shell and stone. The cave was bigger than I expected. The ceiling high enough that my footsteps echoed. The walls were covered in carvings, some deep and fresh, others worn smooth by time and salt. I recognized the symbols from the book, the same ones I'd seen on boats and door frames all over Blackwater Cove. They covered every surface, twisting and overlapping until it felt like the whole cave was alive with them. I kept walking, following the path as it sloped down toward the sound of water. The air smelled like rot and old fish. At the end of the passage, the cave opened into a hollowed-out chamber. That's where I saw it, a statue nearly as tall as the ceiling, rising up from a pile of stones and offerings. The thing wasn't shaped like any god I'd ever heard of. It had a body that almost looked human, but the head stretched too far, the jaw too wide, the neck lined with grooves that looked like gills. Where the eyes should have been, there were just two deep sockets, empty and stretched down toward the jaw.
Its arms ended in claws, and the lower half faded into something that could have been tentacles or just rough stone. Around the base, villagers had left offerings in messy piles. They were the same things I'd seen at the ritual: braids of hair, animal bones, bits of jewelry, but there were also scraps of fabric, stained and torn, and knives with dried blood on the blades. The symbols around the statue's feet told their own story, one of bargains and debts, of blessings given and curses returned. It was all there, carved in a language I couldn't read, but somehow understood. The worship here wasn't about hope, it was about fear and survival. Legends speak of coastal idols carved by disappeared villagers, said to appease an ancient sea god slumbering beneath the cliffs. The statue looked old, but the offerings around it were fresh. The villagers hadn't just built this thing and forgotten it. They kept coming back, kept leaving gifts, kept making sure the sea stayed full. I stepped closer, my breath loud in the cold air. The carvings on the statue's chest showed people kneeling, their heads bowed, arms outstretched toward the waves. Another panel showed the sea rising up, swallowing figures whole. The message was clear: obey or be taken. There was no promise of mercy, just a warning. I thought about the villagers, how they moved through town with their heads down and their eyes wide. I thought about the way they'd changed during the ritual, bodies twisting until they barely looked human. It wasn't just a show. The transformation was part of the deal, an exchange, one life for another, one shape for another. The town had lived with this for generations. The curse wasn't just something they feared. It was something they'd accepted. I didn't know how long I stood there staring at the statue and the mess of offerings around it. My mind kept circling the same thought. The villagers weren't victims anymore. They were part of the cycle. They gave what the sea wanted, and in return, they survived. For now. The air in the cave felt thicker the longer I stayed. I started to feel watched, like the empty eyes in the statue's face could see me. I backed away, careful not to touch the offerings. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift in the light, the lines moving like ripples on water. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it stuck with me as I made my way back out to the night. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of salt and decay. The village was quiet, the streets empty. I walked back through town, the book heavy in my coat pocket. Every window was dark. Every door was shut tight. I kept thinking about the statue and the carvings, about the way the villagers had looked at me when I first arrived. They knew what was out there. They'd made their peace with it. I didn't sleep, I just sat at the edge of the bed watching the sky lighten through the thin curtains. The sense of dread didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger as the sun started to rise. I felt like I was carrying something with me, something heavy and cold, and I knew I couldn't stay in Blackwater Cove any longer. By the time I heard the first gulls calling, I'd made up my mind. I grabbed my bag, stuffed the book inside, and headed for the car. The road out of town was rough, the gravel spitting under my tires as I pulled away from the village. I didn't look back. The fog was rolling in again, thick and low, swallowing the road ahead. I kept my eyes forward, hands tight on the wheel, hoping distance would be enough. The Mercedes jolted as it rolled over a patch of rough gravel, the headlights flickering against the thick, living fog that curled around the car like tendrils, masking any hint of escape. The map on the passenger seat felt useless now. Just another piece of paper that couldn't help him. Every mile away from Blackwater Cove should have felt like progress, but the fog kept swallowing the road, making each passing second stretch out until it felt like time itself was stuck in place. I tried to focus on the little things, the hum of the engine, the way the seat pressed into my back, the faint rattle from the glove box with every bump. It was easier than thinking about the faces I'd seen, the way they twisted under the moon, or the statue in that cave. those memories pressed in from the edges, trying to crowd out the present. I kept my eyes locked on the small slice of road the headlights could reach, but even that was shrinking, the fog thickening until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel made of wet wool. After a while, everything outside the car faded to grey. The trees vanished, the sky disappeared, and the world narrowed to the dashboard and the trembling beams of light ahead. The silence grew heavier, settling over everything, dulling the sound of the engine and even my own breathing. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles aching, and told myself to keep going, to just keep moving forward. Then the sound started. First, a faint scratch at the window, like a branch dragging across the glass. I tensed, glancing sideways, but saw nothing but swirling mist. Before I could process it, a heavy thud hit the roof, making the whole car shudder. My heart pounded in my chest. I barely had time to react before a sharp crack split the air. The windshield fractured, a jagged line spreading across the glass right in front of me. Each noise came faster than the last, building on top of each other until it felt like something was crawling over the car, testing every surface for a way in. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to outrun the noises, but the fog didn't let up. It pressed closer, swirling and shifting. The road felt like it was getting narrower, the lines on the asphalt bending and fading in and out of view. My eyes kept darting to the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see headlights, or maybe just the empty road behind me. But there was nothing. The fog had erased everything, except the inside of the car and the pounding of my heart. Somewhere in the grey, I started to hear splashing. Soft at first, then sharper, like footsteps moving through shallow water. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Shapes moving just beyond the reach of the headlights, flickering in and out of the mist. They didn't look right. Their bodies seemed to blur at the edges, arms too long, faces stretched into something I couldn't name. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was tired and scared and seeing things that weren't there. But the sounds kept coming, scraping, splashing, and then a low whisper that curled around my ears without ever forming real words. The pounding on the roof came back, harder now, frantic and uneven. I flinched, ducking instinctively, but kept my hands locked on the wheel. I didn't want to look up. I didn't want to see what was making the noise. The urge to stop the car, to get out and run was almost overwhelming, but some stubborn part of me kept my foot on the pedal. I just needed to get out of the fog. That was all that mattered. The fog walked the world outside, twisting the light from the headlights into strange patterns. The shapes behind me seemed to move closer, their outlines growing sharper with every mile. I saw limbs dragging along the ground, wet and glistening, leaving streaks on the glass when they brushed against the car. Their faces, if they even were faces, were just dark patches with eyes that caught the light and reflected it back, wide and unblinking. My breathing turned shallow, each inhale feeling like it scraped against the inside of my chest. A sudden crack made me jump. The windshield splintered further, the line cutting deeper across my field of vision. I muttered no under my breath, willing the car to keep going, to not give out now. The Mercedes lurched forward, tires slipping on the slick gravel before catching again. The fog moved faster, wrapping around the car, hiding everything except the dashboard and the fractured glass. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had started.
leaving behind a silence that felt even more dangerous. Time lost meaning. I couldn't tell if I'd been driving for minutes or hours. The world outside the car stayed the same, grey, shifting, empty. I kept going, not daring to slow down. Eventually the fog began to thin, peeling away from the road like it was being pulled back by some invisible hand. The trees returned, their branches sharp against the pale sky. The road stretched out ahead, wet and shining in the headlights, and I finally let myself breathe. I reached over and turned on the radio, needing something, anything to fill the silence. Static filled the car, loud and broken, but I didn't care. I just wanted to hear another voice, even if it was just a DJ or a weather report. Then, through the static, I heard it. My name, Robert. The voice hissed, dragging out every syllable.
My breath caught as the voice slithered through the static, pulling me back into the nightmare. I stared at the radio, waiting for it to stop, but the voice came again, softer this time, almost inside my head. Robert Borne. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the mirror, refusing to do anything but move forward. The fog was gone, but I knew it wasn't really over. Something had followed me out of Blackwater Cove. I could feel it, like a shadow pressed just behind my eyes, waiting for me to let my guard down. The miles passed by in silence, the sky growing lighter as dawn crept in. I didn't stop until the city skyline appeared on the horizon, sharp and distant, promising some kind of normalcy. But the sense of dread stayed with me, heavy and cold, as if the fog had seeped into my bones and settled there for good. I kept driving, not sure what I was running from or what I'd brought with me. Even as the city lights flickered on in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. Back in New York, I tried to act like nothing had changed. The city was loud, crowded, and indifferent, just the way I remembered it. But inside my apartment, everything felt off. The walls seemed to press in, the air hung heavy, and the suitcase I'd brought back from Blackwater Cove sat untouched by the door, its damp leather smell creeping into the corners. I barely slept. When I did drift off, it was only for a few minutes before the same images snapped me awake. Villagers twisting under the moon, the statue's hollow gaze, the endless pulsing tide. I'd stare at the ceiling, sheets tangled around my legs, and wonder if I'd ever get a full night's rest again. The exhaustion set in quickly. My hands shook when I tried to pour coffee, and I'd catch myself flinching at small noises, clammy skin, tremors, the tide's whisper in every corner. Those were the things I couldn't shake. Sometimes I'd think I heard water moving behind the walls, or catch a salty tang in the air that shouldn't have been there. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong. My skin had gone pale, almost sickly, with shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there before. My pupils seemed too wide, swirling up the color. Was I unraveling, or had the curse marked me forever? I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just lack of sleep, just nerves, just the after effects of what I'd seen. But the feeling never left. The static buzz under my skin grew stronger every day. And sometimes I'd look down and swear I saw the faintest shimmer of moisture on my arms, even when the room was dry. The smallest things set me on edge. My footsteps sounded louder in the hallway, and I caught myself checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. At work, I was useless. I'd always been the guy who could keep his cool, but now I jumped at the sound of a phone ringing or a drawer slamming shut. When Dolores handed me a case file, my hand jerked away before I could stop it. I tried to apologize, but the words came out wrong. She gave me a look, worried but polite, and went back to her desk. By the third day, nobody asked if I was okay. Captain Willis stopped me after my shift, his voice low. "You need time off, Borne. You're not yourself." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to explain it,
How do you tell someone you feel like you're being watched from the inside out? The symbols from the cove followed me everywhere. I saw them in the chipped paint on subway walls, in the patterns of rain on my window. Sometimes they seemed to move, twisting just out of sight. I'd blink and they'd be gone, but the feeling they left behind stayed. It wasn't just paranoia. It was like the world had shifted, and I was the only one who noticed. I started to wonder if I'd ever really left Blackwater Cove, or if some part of me was still trapped there, circling the same old secrets. The dreams got worse. I'd find myself standing at the edge of a black sea, the moon hanging low and bright above the water. The tide would pull at me, not just from the shore, but from inside, as if something deep beneath the waves was calling my name. I'd see shapes rising from the water, slick, shifting, with eyes that never blinked. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my chest cold and sticky, the faint scent of salt water filling the room. No matter how many times I showered, I couldn't wash it away. One night, I caught myself scratching at my arms, trying to get rid of an itch that wouldn't go away. My skin felt tight, like it belonged to someone else. The whispers started then, not real words, but the rhythm of waves, the low hum of the tide, always at the edge of hearing. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and listen to the water moving through the pipes, trying to tell myself it was just the building settling. But the sound never matched the pattern I knew. It was something older, something that had followed me home. I stopped trusting what I saw. The city seemed to blur at the edges, the lights too bright, the shadows too deep. I'd see faces in the crowd that looked almost familiar, eyes a little too large, skin a little too pale. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of someone watching me from across the street, but when I looked again, they were gone. The sense of isolation grew sharper. I was surrounded by people, but I'd never felt more alone. On the 7th night, I found myself driving with no destination. The city lights faded behind me and I ended up at the harbour. The air was colder there, thick with the smell of salt and diesel. I walked to the end of the pier, my boots thudding on the planks. The water below moved in slow, heavy circles, reflecting the city's neon in broken lines. I gripped the railing, knuckles white, and stared down into the black. The tide whispered my name, soft at first, then louder, until it filled my head. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just stood there, frozen, feeling the pull inside my chest, the same pull I'd felt in the cove. I knew then that whatever I'd seen in Blackwater Cove wasn't finished with me. The curse didn't end at the village limits. It was a debt, and I'd carried it with me. The sea always finds you, no matter how far you run. I stood on that pier for what felt like hours, listening to the water, waiting for something to rise from the depths. The city was close, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Back in my apartment, I tried to write down what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. The memories twisted as soon as I tried to pin them down. I kept seeing the statues' hollow eyes, the villagers' warped faces, the symbols that seemed to move on their own. I wondered if I was losing my mind or if I'd just seen too much. Maybe there are things people aren't meant to know. Maybe some truths are too heavy to carry. I kept asking myself if I could have turned back, if I could have left the cove before I saw what lay beneath the waves. But it was too late. The price of glimpsing the abyss wasn't something you could pay off or forget. It was something you lived with, every day, in every shadow and every whisper of the tide. Some nights I'd catch myself staring at the window, waiting for the fog to roll in, for the shapes to appear just beyond the glass. I'd listen to the city outside, the hum of traffic, and the distant wail of sirens, and wonder if anyone else had ever come back from a place like Blackwater Cove, or if, like me, they just learned to live with the knowledge that the world is bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than anyone wants to believe. There's a cost to seeing what hides beneath the surface. I paid it, and I still don't know if it was worth it.
But once you've looked into the abyss, it never really lets you go. It waits, patient and silent, just out of sight. And sometimes, surviving is only the beginning. After everything that happened in Blackwater Cove, I thought getting out would be enough. I thought putting distance between myself and that place would break whatever grip it had on me. But it didn't work that way. The curse didn't stay behind. It came with me, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. It was never about just making it out alive. It was about what you carry back, even when you try to leave it all behind. I tried to settle back into my old life, but nothing felt right. My apartment looked the same, but the air felt heavier. I'd sit at my kitchen table, staring at the walls, listening to the city outside, but it was like I was hearing it through a layer of water. I didn't unpack my suitcase. I barely touched the things I'd brought back. Some nights, I'd wake up with the taste of salt on my lips, my sheets damp and cold, the sound of the tide echoing in my ears. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the feeling to pass. It never really did. I stopped talking about it, even to myself. There wasn't any way to explain what I'd seen. The villagers, the rituals, the way the moonlight twisted their faces into something that wasn't quite human anymore. The cave, with its carvings and offerings, the statue that looked like it had been waiting for centuries. I knew if I tried to tell anyone, it would sound like a story made up by someone who'd lost his grip. So I kept quiet. I went through the motions at work, kept my head down, tried to act like everything was fine. But it wasn't. The curse traveled with me. Its whispers and saltwater stains a constant reminder. Sometimes, I'd catch myself scratching at my arms, chasing an itch that never went away. Other times, I'd hear the tide, even when I was blocks away from the river. The sound threading through the city noise. There were days when my hands shook so badly, I had to hide them in my pockets. I'd smell salt water in the air, even when the sky was clear. I'd see symbols in the cracks of the sidewalk, in the way rain streaked down my window. It was always there, just out of sight, just out of reach. I started to wonder if the villagers had ever really been free, or if they'd just learned to live with the weight of what they knew. The stories I'd read about other cursed places, like Patua, came back to me. Those people survived, but the curse didn't let them go. The trauma stuck around, shaping everything that came after. That's how it was for me. I survived, but the cost was high. And it followed me everywhere. The worst part was the voice. It started as a whisper, soft and easy to ignore, but it grew louder with every passing night. Sometimes it sounded like waves, sometimes like my own heartbeat, sometimes like a word I almost recognized. Eventually it became a phrase I couldn't shake. The tide always comes back. I'd hear it when I was alone, when I was tired, when I let my guard down. It was a warning and a promise, all at once. I avoided water as much as I could. Showers became quick, tense affairs. I kept away from puddles, from the river, from the ocean, but it didn't matter. Water found its way in. Rain tapped out patterns on my windows. The shower sputtered and spat. The river seemed closer than ever. Sometimes I'd find myself drawn to the harbour, standing at the edge, staring down into the black water, feeling the pull inside my chest. I hated it, but I couldn't stay away. There were nights when I'd think about going back, just to see if there were answers I'd missed. Maybe there was something in Blackwater Cove that could explain what had happened, something that would let me put it all to rest. But every time I thought about returning, the whisper would come back, reminding me that the tide didn't care about answers. It just wanted what it wanted. The horror of it all, the idea that people are small, that we mean nothing in the face of something so old and vast, never left me. I'd seen it for myself. In Blackwater Cove, it didn't matter what I did, how hard I tried to fight, or how much I wanted to understand. The tide was always there, bigger than me, older than anyone could remember. It didn't need a reason. It just was. Even when you survive, the knowledge stays with you. It changes you. I kept asking myself if it would have been better not to know. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some truths are too heavy to carry. I'd lie awake, listening to the city, wondering if anyone else had ever come back from a place like Blackwater Cove and managed to live a normal life. I doubted it. The scars run too deep. I learned to live with it, or at least to pretend. The world outside kept moving, but for me, everything felt different. The curse wasn't just about what happened in that village, it was about carrying the memory, the fear, the sense that something is always watching, always waiting. The tide's rhythm never left me. It echoed in the spaces between thoughts, in the quiet moments, in the way I flinched at the sound of water.